Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going all the way to Peru. We're going to try to unpack the story of Alejandro Toledo.
A captivating story.
Yeah, a man who climbed from poverty to power.
Ultimately, a tragic story.
Yeah, and it's got it all. Ambition, intrigue, and a healthy dose of how did it come to this?
What's really interesting about Toledo's story is how much it reflects, the larger picture in Peru, a country really grappling with these deep social and economic divides.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Paint us a picture. Where did Toledo come from?
Wow.
Our sources describe this village in the Andes Mountains as a place often overlooked, even by the rest of Peru.
Yeah, it's not your typical tourist destination. We're talking about Cabana, a place where poverty is just a fact of life. Opportunity is scarce, and for many, the idea of upward mobility feels like a distant dream.
And that's where our story begins. This aspiring president shining shoes as a kid, selling lottery tickets just to help his family survive.
Yeah. Our sources talk about how Toledo faced hardship from a young age, losing siblings to poverty, having to shoulder adult responsibilities as a child. It's a stark contrast to the halls of power he would eventually occupy.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around, but what's even more incredible is that he manages to excel in school, eventually earns scholarships, first to a university in Lima, and then, get this, to Stanford University in the United States.
Yeah.
Talk about beating the odds.
And that's a key point here because his narrative, his personal narrative of triumphing over adversity, became central to his political identity. You see, in a country with a history of inequality, Toledo's story, it resonated. He represented, at least initially, the possibility of social mobility, a beacon of hope for the marginalized, a testament to the power of education.
Which makes you wonder, as one of our sources points out, when did Alejandro Toledo's life go wrong? I mean, here he is, this brilliant economist. He's rubbing shoulders with the best at the World Bank, advising governments. He was living proof that change was possible.
It's a question that echoes throughout history, isn't it? How do even the most well-intentioned individuals navigate the seductive and often corrupting nature of power?
It's like that classic scene in superhero movies, the hero standing at a crossroads, tempted by the dark side.
Right.
But this isn't fiction.
Precisely. And to understand how things unfolded, it's crucial to examine the context of Toledo's rise to power. In the late 1990s, Peru was reeling from the authoritarian regime of Alberto Fujimori, who, despite some early successes, eventually became embroiled in his own web of corruption and human rights abuses.
So the stage is set. A nation yearning for change, for a leader who can restore faith in democracy. And that's where Toledo steps in.
Exactly. He emerges as a vocal critic of the Fujimori regime, leading protests like the Four Corners March, a massive demonstration that brought together Peruvians from all walks of life demanding Fujimori's resignation.
Wow.
It's a powerful image. Toledo, the embodiment of hope, leading the charge for democracy.
And this sets the stage for his own presidency. In 2001, he's elected as Peru's first president of indigenous descent, a symbol of progress, a new era for the nation. But then things get complicated, to say the least.
Indeed. While Toledo's presidency started with promise, marked by economic growth and social reforms, whispers of scandal began to surface. These whispers would eventually crescendo into a roar with the emergence of the Odebrecht scandal,
Uh-oh.
a sprawling corruption investigation that would rock Latin America and ultimately prove to be Toledo's undoing.
Okay, so before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk about Odebrecht. For those unfamiliar, what exactly are we dealing with here?
Odebrecht was, at the time, a Brazilian construction giant, known for undertaking these massive infrastructure projects across Latin America. But behind this facade of corporate success lurked a sinister secret, a department dedicated to bribery and corruption. They called it the Division of Structured Operations.
Structured operations? That sounds organized, like something out of a spy thriller.
You could say that.
Yeah.
They ran a tight ship, keeping detailed records, code names, the works. But their luck wouldn't last forever.
And this is where our deep dive into Alejandro Toledo's life takes a sharp turn.
It does indeed. Because one of Odebrecht's prime targets for these structured operations was none other than Peru, and at the heart of this scheme was the Interoceanica Highway. This massive infrastructure project, intended to connect Brazil to Peruvian ports on the Pacific, became a focal point for Odebrecht's corrupt dealings.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because the Interoceanica Highway wasn't just some road project.
Right.
This thing had the potential to be a game changer for Peru, boosting trade, connecting communities, generating tons of revenue. So we're talking about serious money, serious potential, and ultimately serious corruption.
Absolutely. And the allegations against Toledo are not just about backroom deals or like minor infractions. We're talking about large-scale bribery, with Odebrecht executives claiming that Toledo himself personally solicited millions of dollars in exchange for ensuring the company secured the contracts for the Interoceanica Highway.
And the details really paint a picture, don't they? Our sources mention a key Odebrecht executive, Jorge Barada, who testified that Toledo would call him directly demanding his bribe money. He even quoted Toledo using a rather, let's just say, colorful phrase in Portuguese, which we won't repeat here, but let's just say it showed a certain level of comfort, maybe even audacity, in their alleged dealings.
Barada's testimony would become a pivotal piece of the puzzle, shedding light on the inner workings of Odebrecht's scheme. But what's truly fascinating is that this scandal wasn't confined to Peru. It was like a domino effect.
Right, this wasn't just a local problem.
Exactly. The investigation into Odebrecht, fueled in part by the massive Lava Jato investigation in Brazil, essentially a sprawling investigation into corruption that uncovered a vast network of bribery and money laundering across Latin America, exposed a web of corruption that spanned multiple countries, and implicated numerous high-ranking officials.
Wow. It's a stark reminder that corruption often operates in the shadows, crossing borders, and thriving in the murky waters of power and greed.
Precisely. And unfortunately for Alejandro Toledo, this particular spotlight was about to shine directly on him.
This is where things start to unravel, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
From the Andes Mountains to Stanford Law, and now facing allegations of corruption on a massive scale. Talk about a fall from grace.
It is indeed a dramatic turn of events, but it's important to note that this isn't just about one man's fall from grace. It's about the erosion of trust, the disillusionment of a nation, and the lasting consequences of corruption.
Well, on that note, let's pause here for a moment, because the story of Alejandro Toledo doesn't end here. Far from it. We'll be back in a moment to trace his journey from the heights of power to becoming an international fugitive and ultimately facing the music for his alleged crimes. Stay with us. And we're back. Before the break, we were talking about the Odebrecht scandal and how it swept across Latin America, eventually catching up with our main character, Alejandro Toledo. Talk about your fall from grace.
It's a really stark example of how quickly things can change, especially in the world of politics. One minute you're the face of hope and progress, you're leading marches for democracy. The next, you're at the center of this huge international corruption scandal.
And the thing is, at this point, Toledo is no stranger to scrutiny. He'd faced accusations of corruption during his presidency. But nothing quite like this, you know? This time the evidence seems pretty damning.
Right, the net is closing in. Odebrecht executives are singing like canaries. Peruvian prosecutors are building their case. And Toledo's facing a really uncertain future.
So what does he do?
Well, this is where things take an even more dramatic turn. In 2015, just as the Odebrecht scandal is exploding across the region, Toledo decides to leave Peru and return to the United States.
Interesting timing. I'm sensing a connection here.
Yeah, I think you'd be right to be suspicious. You see, Toledo holds dual citizenship in both Peru and the United States. He claims he's returning to Stanford for academic work, which, given his history, seems plausible on the surface, right? But the timing, as you pointed out, is incredibly suspect.
Yeah, it's not a good look, especially as these accusations against him are piling up.
Exactly. And the Peruvian authorities are not fooled. They see this move for what it is, an attempt to evade justice. They quickly initiate extradition proceedings, seeking to bring Toledo back to Peru to stand trial.
Okay, so let's break down this extradition process for a second, because I imagine it's not as simple as just asking nicely for another country to, like, hand someone over.
You're absolutely right. Extradition is this really complex and often lengthy legal battle. Especially when you're dealing with a former head of state. It's like a diplomatic and legal dance between the two countries involved.
So in this case, we have Peru saying, he's our guy, we want him back, and the U.S. is kind of stuck in the middle.
Precisely. And the United States has a pretty rigorous extradition treaty with Peru, meaning they have to carefully weigh the evidence. They have to make sure due process is followed.
Which in this case could take years.
It can, yeah.
And that's exactly what happened.
You nailed it. What follows is this protracted legal battle that drags on for nearly a decade. Toledo, armed with a team of high-powered lawyers, fights tooth and nail, challenging the charges, claiming political persecution. He's exhausting every legal avenue available to resist extradition.
And all the while, he's living in the United States, essentially a free man. And back in Peru, the public is left to grapple with this sense of betrayal. The frustration of a justice system seemingly unable to hold the powerful accountable.
And it's interesting because this is a point of contention in the source material. Some sources argue that his ability to evade justice for so long just further eroded public trust in institutions, while others maintain that the lengthy extradition process was totally necessary to ensure a fair trial.
Yeah.
It went back and forth.
Yeah, it's a classic example of that tension between due process and the public's desire for swift justice. But eventually the walls start to close in.
They do. In 2023, after years of appeals and legal maneuvering, a U.S. judge rules in favor of Peru. Yeah, it was a major turning point in the saga, signifying that even former presidents are not above the law. And this paves the way for Toledo's return to Peru.
And so, in 2024, almost a decade after fleeing Peru, Alejandro Toledo finds himself right back where it all began, landing in Lima. But not as a revered elder statesman, but as a man facing these serious charges of corruption.
The images of his arrival, I don't know if you've seen them, but they speak volumes. Gone is the confident, charismatic leader we saw during his presidency. Instead, we see this haggard, somber man, head bowed, escorted by police. It's a stark reminder of how far he's fallen.
It's almost Shakespearean, isn't it? The rise, the fall, the exile, the return. But this is where the real drama begins.
It does, because now comes the trial, the reckoning, the opportunity for Peru to confront these ghosts of corruption that have haunted the nation for so long.
And the question is, can the Peruvian justice system deliver the accountability that people are demanding? Can it heal the wounds of the past and restore faith in the rule of law?
Those are questions we'll explore in just a moment. But first,
we're back to the story of Alejandro Toledo. Once a beacon of hope for Peru, now facing trial for corruption. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And I think those images we were talking about of Toledo arriving back in Peru, they really capture the weight of this moment. You know, the weight of the accusations, the weight of public expectation, the weight of history itself.
Yeah, it makes you think about legacy, doesn't it? How do we want to be remembered? What will people say about us when we're gone?
It's a question that probably weighs heavily on anyone, especially someone in a position of power, but maybe even more so on someone like Toledo, a man who came from such humble beginnings and then rose to become this, this symbol of hope for so many people.
And then to have that legacy tarnished by scandal, by these allegations of basically betraying the very people that he vowed to serve.
It's a tragic turn of events, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And it speaks to a much larger issue that Peru and, frankly, many countries around the world are grappling with, that corrosive impact of corruption on society.
It's not just about the money, is it?
No, not at all.
It's about the erosion of trust. It's that feeling of disillusionment, the sense that the system is rigged against the average person.
Exactly. When people lose faith in their leaders, when they feel like the deck is stacked against them, it creates this breeding ground for cynicism and apathy, which ultimately undermines, the very fabric of democracy.
And in Toledo's case, this disillusionment is palpable. Our sources describe a nation really grappling with this sense of betrayal, questioning how the man who promised so much could end up embroiled in such a massive scandal.
Yeah, and there's this feeling of, how could this happen? That comes up a lot in the source material we looked at. And this other question, maybe even more important, what does this say about us? About us as a society?
So as Toledo's trial unfolds, the question becomes, can the Peruvian justice system deliver? Can it deliver the accountability that people are demanding? Can it heal the wounds of the past and restore faith in the rule of law?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's a question with no easy answers. I mean, on the one hand, you have a justice system that has struggled. It's struggled with corruption, with inefficiency for years, and it's often failed to hold the powerful accountable.
So there's that skepticism, that feeling of, here we go again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you have a public that's fed up, that's demanding change, that is no longer willing to tolerate business as usual.
So there's hope, too, that this time might be different.
Perhaps. And that's what makes Toledo's trial such a pivotal moment for Peru. It's not just about one man's fate, right? It's about a nation grappling with its past, confronting its demons, and deciding what kind of future it wants to build.
It's about drawing a line in the sand, saying enough is enough.
Exactly. And that ultimately is the deeper message within Alejandro Toledo's story. It's a reminder that power, no matter how absolute it may seem, is fleeting. It's a reminder that actions have consequences, that even those who seem untouchable can be held accountable. And it's a reminder that the fight for transparency, for justice, for a more equitable society, that's a fight worth fighting.
Because in the end, it's not just about Peru. It's about all of us, everywhere. demanding better from our leaders, holding them to a higher standard, and working towards a world where stories like Toledo's are the exception, not the rule.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
I think you're right. It's a lot to unpack, and I'm sure our listeners have a lot to think about.
Indeed. As always, we encourage you to explore the source material yourself, draw your own conclusions, and to continue the conversation.
Because that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
Learning, questioning, and engaging with the world around us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time.